The imposter syndrome at its core is a cognitive distortion, right? It is your own mind twisting facts, twisting reality so that you aren't able to enjoy your own success. It's keeping you from feeling your own self-confidence and your own competency. And so this imposter syndrome, it blocks you, it cuts you off from being able to experience that feeling of satisfaction and that feeling of accomplishment with what you've done and how you've grown.
You're watching Developing Potential with Diana Keuilian.
Hi friends, welcome back. Today we're talking about the critic in your head, and we're talking about this concept and this phenomenon of the imposter syndrome. Maybe you've felt this before, this negative voice in your head that chips away at your self-esteem. And really, it's really mean, Most of us have had some experience like this. And then this idea of the imposter syndrome, where we feel like a fraud, or we feel like the bottom's going to drop out and everyone's going to know that we're not really good enough, right? And so let's dive into this. And this weekend, I spent some time on Audible because I love listening to books when I run and when I exercise, or if I'm just doing chores around the house. My minutes on Audible is very high. And most of the time I'm listening to psychology books, and I'm listening to things that are going to further my education and my curiosity about the human mind and emotions and all these different things. But once in a while, I will just listen to a novel because I want to relax my mind a little bit and enjoy a story. And so this weekend I was listening to Eleanor, Oliphant is Completely Fine. And I am going to give a spoiler on this book. So if you're listening to it or reading it or plan to, then plug your ears. But in this book, so we get to know this character, and, the story as it unravels, we get to know her more and get to understand her more. But one thing is certain is she has an incredibly critical mother. And every single week she calls her mom on Wednesday nights, and this woman is horrendous. Like, she just tears her daughter down and is such a discouraging voice. And we see, Eleanor dreads these phone calls, but she still makes them. She's this dutiful daughter. And, when bad things happen in her life, this mom, this cruel mom, celebrates. And you're listening, you're like, how can this be? This person is horrible. And then we get, and the whole time you're like, why does she keep calling her? Why do you call her every Wednesday? Let's put this voice down. And then we get to the end of the book, and you find out that her mother has actually been dead for the past 20 years. And these conversations that she has with her mom are really just taking place in her mind. And so this cruel, negative voice of her mother is still living inside of her and is criticizing all the choices she makes, and is, comparing her to people and really cutting her down. And while this is a very extreme case, because, this character really was believing that she's talking to her mother, it really is informative of what happens to so many of us, right? When we're in our formative years, and if we have a caretaker or someone in our life who has a negative take on things, or maybe just sees what's wrong with every situation. And if you're that child that's in front of them, then they're going to find what's wrong with you. Or you could have done this differently. You could have done this better, right? Speaking from my own experience, I definitely had that, adult figure who found all of my flaws. And so as we're taking this in our formative years, what so often happens is this voice of a critic, right? You maybe have heard the term inner critic, essentially has its own life in our own head. And now as an adult, you're going about your life and you're trying to achieve things and you're trying to develop yourself and evolve and go after your dreams, this voice is still in your head. And this voice knows exactly what to say to cut you down, to point out whatever flaws may or may not be there, and to really keep you small. And so, as I listened to this book over the weekend, I realized that, I definitely still have that voice of a critic that crops up in my mind, and in the past, in different episodes, I've talked about kind of giving a face or a persona to the voice, to externalize it, right? To kind of separate from it. Because, so many of these things that happen in our heads, the way to move through it is to become the observer of it. And when we step back and we become that observer, we're able to create some space. And when we create that space, we're able to really just diffuse whatever's happening. We can look at it with a fresh perspective, and it becomes smaller and it's less overwhelming to us. Spend a little bit of time reflecting on your own experience and thinking about those times when a voice crops up in your mind and really starts pointing out your flaws or starts cutting you down. And really, what happens next? And here's the real reason that we want to address the critic in our head. And the real reason why we want to get a handle on this before it becomes the imposter syndrome is because it slows us down in some ways, right? Depending on the content of what your critic is saying and the context of when this critical voice crops up, most of the time that voice is there to make us smaller. And it might make you want to take fewer risks or put yourself out there less, right? If you want to do something new and different, but in the back of your mind that your inner critic is going to have a field day with you, maybe similar to how someone in your past has actually verbally done this to you, then you're less likely to do it. You're less likely to try something new and to stretch yourself when you believe that you're going to be criticized. And so the first step is really just even identifying the fact that there is a critic in your mind, right? And paying attention to when it starts to speak up. And so in those moments, taking the time to separate yourself and become that observer of okay, I tried this, and while maybe it wasn't a perfect success, it also wasn't a complete failure, right? When you try something, I recently started doing Pilates. I've been in fitness for years and done many things, but I had never tried Pilates. And so over the past few weeks, I've been taking more the beginner classes and working my way up and getting some competency. But let me tell you, when you're trying these new moves that you've never done before on this crazy machine, I'm not doing it gracefully. And some of the moves, it's it's shaky, or I can tell my form isn't the way it should be. It's not horrible, but I'm not nailing it. And there's many mirrors in this Pilates studio. And so I definitely, my inner critic kind of peaks up sometimes when I'm looking at my form and trying to do a new move. And it's oh my gosh, are you kidding me? And in those moments, I have the opportunity to be okay, I'm not coming back. I don't want to try this again because I can't do it perfectly. Or I can, take that notice that the critic is speaking up, right? Notice that that's not me. That's the voice of my inner critic. And it might sound like someone from my past, right? And I love to personify my inner critic as a dragon. And the reason that I do this, there's multiple reasons, but I like to do it because it kind of makes me laugh. And I picture like a goofy dragon. And this character is out to get me, right? His only mission is to make sure that I do not succeed, that I don't push myself to do new things, and that I just stay really, really small. Like this dragon just wants to see me like do the opposite of develop. He wants to see me like regress and be this helpless thing. And so I'm in the Pilates class, I'm doing the new moves, and the dragon starts like kind of snickering in my ear like, oh my God, like you're not very good at this. And it makes me kind of giggle when I can look at it as this externalized character who is essentially against me. And it puts it in a different perspective, as opposed to when we allow the voice of the critic to really be this voice of authority, then it has the power to stop us. And going back to that book, the Eleanor Oliphant is completely fine. This voice of her, her deceased mother is such an authority in her mind. First of all, she's believing like my mother's still alive and she still has some kind of power over me. And at the time of the book, she's a 30-year-old woman, right? But this inner critic that was formed so firmly in her formative years has such authority over her. And so the first step to like releasing that and you're reducing the level of authority of that inner critic is to notice it as separate from you. And then if you can kind of personify it in a way that makes you either laugh or makes you feel competitive, like I'm not going to let them win, right? And depending on your situation, if you did have someone in your youth who was really negative with you and really picked at you and cut you down, when you realize like that's their voice in my head, it might change things for you. You might feel like now you want to defend yourself, or now you want to prove them wrong in some way. But that first step is stepping back, noticing, and then separating. Okay, so the imposter syndrome. This is kind of a popular term that, floats around on the internet and people talk about. But really, when we talk about feeling like we're an imposter, one of the main parts of the syndrome is not being able to experience or enjoy your success. I've definitely had this in the past where maybe I've accomplished something. One of the examples is my first published cookbook. I remember getting the box, bringing it into the house, sitting down, opening it up, and then I found a typo on the first page. And, as I'm opening the box, as I'm looking at the cover and opening it, I've got like this feeling of accomplishment and success. And then as soon as I saw that typo, my inner critic like locked onto it. And then I jumped right into imposter syndrome. And I felt like a fraud. Like, how can I be proud of this published cookbook when on page 1, there's a mistake, right? And so feeling separate from your accomplishments, feeling separate from your strengths, right? Not being able to appreciate and enjoy the feeling of like, I did that. I succeeded, right? If you're focusing on the things that you could have done better or the things that you messed up on along the way to this accomplishment, then you're feeling that imposter syndrome, right? We're looking at the negative and the deficit. We're not able to enjoy the positive and the accomplishment. And so really, the imposter syndrome at its core is a cognitive distortion, right? It is your own mind twisting facts, twisting reality so that you aren't able to enjoy your own success. It's keeping you from feeling your own self-confidence and your own competency, because you have competency. Everything that you do, you have some level of competency. And every time that you do it, you gain competency. And so this imposter syndrome, it blocks you, it cuts you off from being able to experience that feeling of satisfaction and that feeling of accomplishment with what you've done and how you've grown. And so you may feel, if you've identified like, yep, this makes sense. Yes, I have that voice of a critic in my head. Yes, I've experienced this feeling of like, that's not my success. I'm a fraud. Like, people might find out and everything in my life is going to crumble. You're going to notice just an overall lack of confidence, right? So it's almost like if this voice of a critic started out and it grew and then it turned into a syndrome, and it means basically it's permeating all of your experiences, right? It's such a part of how you experience yourself now. And so then the overall effect is a chipping away at your self-confidence. And then along with that goes just some ongoing anxiety, right? There's a struggle happening inside of us about this perceived inadequacy. And I want to stress that word perceived inadequacy because, like we determined, this imposter syndrome, it's a cognitive distortion. We're not working with facts, right? If we were working with facts, then we would be able to take in the good and the strengths along with the deficits and the areas for improvement, right? And so looking at this as perceived inadequacy and not as fact is going to help us to move through it. And rest assured, no matter where you are with your inner critic and with possibly having this experience of the imposter syndrome, wherever you are with it, it is possible to move through it and to get to the other side of it. It's such a normal human experience to have this critic in our head and to even allow it to get to this point of living with the imposter syndrome. Having this experience does not take away from who you are as a person, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with you. And it's such a human experience to go through this, but where we have the opportunity to grow and to really rise above it is in separating ourselves from this experience, observing what's happening as the observer, right? Not as the voice, not as this feeling of anxiety, just separating from it, being able to notice it, and then we can start to let it go. Okay, so ways to really move through the imposter syndrome and to put down that critic in your head. The first one that we've gone over is really, can you personify it? Can you link some kind of character or image to this critical voice? Because the second that you do that, that voice is no longer you. And with that distinction and that little step back, you are immediately gaining control and quieting the voice of that inner critic. So can you turn it into a dragon? Can you turn it into your second grade teacher who criticized everyone in the class, and you can look at it and just laugh and be like, you know what? This is not something that I'm going to take serious. Okay, another idea is to journal about it, right? Again, we want to get it out of our head and we want to start looking at it. Instead of just experiencing it, we want to look at it. And so can you journal about it? Especially if you're putting yourself in a place where you're trying to grow and maybe that critic is coming up more, that feeling of I'm an imposter is coming up more in a certain arena, right? Journal about it at the end of the day or in the moment, pull out the notes app on your phone and just like jot down like, okay, this is what the critic said, just to get it out of your head, right? And then another thing is to really work on mindset and positive expectations. Because if the voice of the critic and this imposter syndrome is really trying to like squish you and, smother your efforts, having a positive mindset, a growth mindset, and having positive expectations for yourself, your abilities, and your future, it's like the opposite, right? So if we have these two warring sides inside of us, well, let's feed the growth mindset. Let's feed those positive expectations. And we've talked in the past about the theater of the mind and how we can go in there and we can create this future for ourselves and this new version of ourselves that's risen above this critic, right? And so strengthening that, and then really pulling the rug out from the inner critic by personifying it, stepping back from it, and really knowing and seeing it as a cognitive distortion and as just perceived inadequacies. Really reducing the authority of that voice, putting it in its place, and then strengthening all of those good things about yourself. I hope this has been helpful. And again, I really just hope that you come away from this episode realizing there's absolutely nothing wrong with experiencing a critic in your head. And there's absolutely nothing abnormal about experiencing this imposter syndrome in your life. And really, you've already done the first step to moving past these issues by noticing them, naming them, and really stepping back and separating yourselves from them. So I hope this content has been helpful. Please drop me a comment, like this episode, subscribe. If there's someone in your life who really could use this content, who has a critic in their head, or who maybe has had a person in their life who was very critical of them, send them this link, and hopefully this can help them kind of shift the narrative of their own life so they can take control of their future and really push through with higher and higher levels of self-development, which ultimately means higher levels of happiness. So thank you for joining me. I will be back next week with another message for you. Take care.
Thanks for watching Developing Potential with Diana Keuilian.